And our Major Garrett joins us now from the White House. So, Major, if the president does indeed announce his decision to pull out of this deal, what happens next?
That's the big mystery. What does the president intend to do with the American positioning vis-a-vis the world when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and combating global warming? That part we don't know. There are some conversations, and they've been going on all week, about the president desiring a way to renegotiate the Paris Climate Accord itself, to change the protocols, change the time horizons for reductions nation by nation in greenhouse gas emissions. The president has told his senior advisors he believes the protocols in the Paris Climate Accord now impose way too much regulatory control over U.S. industry, particularly dirty, pollution-producing companies or plants, rather, and he wants those protocols changed in a way that would be less onerous for American industry, particularly the coal industry. Would other nations be willing to renegotiate the Paris Climate Accord after all the long negotiations that led up to the 2015 signing ceremony that we just saw? Maybe, maybe not. If the United States pulls out and says the only way there can be a global consensus is if everyone else adapts to the president's wishes, perhaps. But that's a very big if, and that's one of the reasons Rex Tillerson and some of these other voices I mentioned within the administration are suggesting to the president, once you go down this road, others may not follow, and the United States may be out of step with a global consensus to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. We saw in your piece that basically every other country on the planet has signed this agreement. We would join a very small club made up of Syria, who's been in the middle of a 6-year civil war, and Nicaragua, who those are the only 2 other countries that haven't signed this. If we pull out, you mentioned a little bit about the reaction on the world stage, which is kind of like a big question mark, but also the U.S. sort of leads a vacuum. Typically, the U.S. is leading in this area.
That's right. The other nation that had agreed to the protocols and then withdrawn is Russia. So they're the only other industrialized nation that the United States would join if it were to make this move to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. But there's one part of this that we're missing. When the president signed an executive order in late March, essentially nullifying President Obama's regulatory structure along the lines of what he called a clean power initiative, imposing regulations on coal and other fossil fuel industries in the United States to meet some of these greenhouse gas emission targets. When President Trump eliminated that via an executive order, he more or less told the world then that the mechanisms by which the United States was going to put in place to meet these greenhouse gas emissions targets under the Paris Climate Accord were already being nullified. So to a certain degree, this announcement, I believe, from a policy perspective, is somewhat anticlimactic. It is important for the United States to withdraw, if it does, as a signatory to this deal. But make no mistake, with that late March executive order trying to nullify the Clean Power Initiative under the Obama administration, this White House and this president had already signaled to the world that it was not interested in following those greenhouse gas emissions targets or imposing the regulatory structure on industries in the United States required to meet them. So I think this is kind of a foregone conclusion in terms of the policy that this administration has already put forward. What remains is the explanation to the world and the what comes next part, which we still don't know.
So, Major, we heard in your piece about some of the competing voices the president is hearing from. My guess is that he wouldn't be holding this big announcement in the Rose Garden with all the pomp and circumstance that we've come to expect with President Trump if the plan wasn't perhaps to remove the U.S. from this agreement. But this being President Trump, could he say, psych, I've been listening to some of my other advisors and I plan to renegotiate some aspects of the deal, but for now we're staying in. Could that happen? And if it doesn't happen, what about those advisors who are cautioning him not to pull out of the agreement? What happens to them?
Well, they stay and they're just aware that they lost one. But you raise a very important point, Vlad, and I was talking to a lot of people who are very close to this issue on the ideologically conservative side of the environmental spectrum, who want the administration to pull out of this. They believe it is not something the United States ought to or should be involved in, that nations should pursue their own environmental regulations and not create a global scheme to try to put them together. These conservatives do not agree with a global tax structure that is meant to provide funds to poorer nations to deal with their pollution problems. They just don't believe in those schemes at all. And they want this administration to be absolutely adamant and clear and unequivocal about pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. And as I talked to them last night, they believed all those decisions had been made. And yet, in the very next breath, these people told me, you know, we have been with this administration before on conservative-oriented issues where we thought the decision had been made, and in mere hours, it had been changed and moved away from us into a more centrist or accommodationist position, at least from their ideological point of view. And they told me, just because we believe and have been told this decision has been made, it can be unmade, and they are somewhat nervous about that. But to your point, Vlad, about a Rose Garden ceremony and all the pomp and circumstance, it seems that this president wants to make it clear, fundamentally clear, that this was a campaign promise. He's going to live up to it and try to make the most out of that promise made, promise kept aspect of this debate.
Hate to use the analogy, but this is starting to feel like a reality show finale, waiting to see who gets the rose in the Rose Garden. And we will be watching at 3 o'clock. Major Garrett at the White House, thank you so much.
You got it.